So there are a lot of ethical issues surrounding reproductive cloning, and it starts with the age-old debate: when does life begin? And that's been debated back and forth forever. Another issue is the potential for personhood, and a lot of scientists say that before 14 days, the human embryo has no human form and cannot experience pain. So they claim then, why should we give it value? Where on the other side, you have those who say life begins at conception. The fact that there are 400,000 embryos that are frozen and deteriorating over time and are possibly, potentially going to become non viable has created a new type of adoption. And I previously mentioned the Snowflake program that arranges adoptions of embryos and claims to have had more than 400 babies born as a result of their services that they charge $15,000 for a home study, matching of the embryo to the couple, the transfer, the shipping, and the legal contract. So, that's one of the issues. But another thing is, is this a slippery slope? We're asserting that there's intrinsic value to the embryo. So what happens to them when we consider using them for research? Or if we don't consider the value of the embryo, are we devaluing life? So it's kind of that slippery slope that we've talked about so much this semester. Should they be regarded as commodities? And then that can bring up a whole different issue. And in looking at the issue of the embryos being valuable or being commodities, then should we say that, a person has the responsibility from the time they're able to bear children, they have a responsibility to do that? And should birth control and morning after pills and other sorts of those kind of things that destroy life or, pre-implantation, should we not be allowed to use those things? So again, it's that debate that you can extend either direction that can create the challenges in deciding what is the best thing to do. So going back to what I said a short time ago, there are a lot of scientists who say that for embryos, and it's commonly accepted that before the emergence of the primitive streak at 14 days, there's no possibility of any neural development such that they can feel any pain. There's nothing there to. So it's not likely that they feel pain for a long time after the 14 days. It's entirely possible. So typically, an embryo doesn't look like a human fetus, has no real nervous system until after the time when most abortions are done at about 13 weeks. So what scientists are saying is that because the embryo has no desires about what happens to it, so it has no interest, and so it has no moral status. It doesn't matter whether an embryo fails to implant in the uterine wall, whether it's dislodged by an IUD, or whether it's used in research. So that's kind of what their claim is. So they distinguish between moral status and moral value. Beings can have moral value even if they lack a moral status. To say that something has moral value is to say that there are good reasons for protecting it or being concerned about it. So for some on both sides, embryos have a moral value but no moral status. So there are reasons for protecting their use and for respecting them and not devaluing them as mere tissues. So how much do people really value embryos? 2/3 of the human embryos stored at fertility clinics in England, for example, had to be destroyed because the owners did not respond to a letter asking about their wishes. So again, is there a value to these? And then you have the opposite, where the place in California where the equipment failed, they lost the embryos, and families are assigning a monetary value to what was lost. So again, both sides. With every ethical dilemma, there are two sides. One of the other ethical issues is the concept of respect. And those arguing that although an embryo may not be a person, it's not a rock, it's not, something, it's something that is a future human, so it is worthy of respect. It's not property of an owner, and they have to be viewed in light of their potential for being a future person. So, what does it mean to respect an embryo? Well, what they say is that embryos shouldn't be eating. It shouldn't be, encased in jewelry. Shouldn't be bred into hybrids. So there are ways that you can demonstrate respect for an embryo. It's also possible to treat them with respect within medical research. So researchers who have the privilege of using these human embryos should be taught, required, and legally enjoined to treat them with respect to prevent that slippery slope that we've talked about. With regard to the cost of missed opportunity and missed research, because the federal government did not fund this research, you have to think about what have we missed out on? What advances have we not made by not allowing this line of research to be funded? It's not enough to let private companies or other countries fund this research. We should be doing this research. And by banning the use of embryos in federally funded projects, Congress may have deprived millions of people of new medicines that might otherwise have been discovered for who knows how long. So that's one of the other ethical arguments with regard to reproductive cloning. Another issue is the issue of transplants of foreign organs, blood, and tissue into a patient's body, and how often there is a rejection of this foreign material when it's recognized by the immune system. There are drugs that suppress the immune system to allow the acceptance of that tissue, but may cause issues many years later. And would it be much better to grow your own bone, blood, organs for yourself for future use? So creating embryos from your own cells could be used to grow tissues for your future medical needs. So, that's one of the other opportunities that could have been developed. Can you have warehouses where we could store our own embryonic stem cells or our own stem cells in case in the future we need them? So that's one of the topics of discussion that's come up. However, this very lengthy discussion that we've had, we talked about the development of those iPS cells, means that we can get valuable stem cells for research without destroying human embryos. And, whether we use this as a brilliant scientific discovery or however we view it, the fact that we have this impasse which motivated scientists to seek a way around it, which they did. So, we've gone through this whole historical context to get to where we are today. A lot of researchers would say we should, keep all the tools on the table, and that human embryonic stem cells may be better for some purposes than these iPS cells. But with this new source of stem cells, do we have the same argument with regard to embryonic stem cells? So we've had this, very long discussion about embryonic stem cells, but, has it become more of a moot point? On one side, we're not destroying these embryos anymore, not researching on embryos, but can these iPS cells function the same way as an embryonic stem cell would? So, the debate continues, but we do have better technology now because of these independent researchers that were able to move the science forward. And just to talk briefly about dispelling the myths of reproductive cloning. And there are a couple of them, and you may have heard them. I know I've been hearing these kind of things since it first started with Dolly and beyond. But with cloning, you're not reproducing an existing person. You're not recreating the person, him or herself. You're recreating the genes of that person. You're recreating the genetic base of that person. But a person's identity in part stems from non-genetic sources, such as your experiences growing up. You can't reproduce yourself. And of course, any child wouldn't have the same memories as an adult. So that's one of them. The second one is this sounds funny, but it's been an argument for a long time that clones humans won't be drones but person. A child created by reproductive cloning would, just like every other fetus, need to be gestated by a woman for 9 months. And the child would have no distinguishing marks on him to identify them as a person who was developed by cloning. They would feel, sense, think, hurt just like every other person. They're not going to be walking zombies, as some people have claimed. There are some other issues that are associated with reproductive cloning. I didn't realize that my little cartoon there would play through when it was in the in the slideshow. So you have two things there that say "I am you." So other issues that arise is one is the right to a unique genetic identity, and with Dolly's birth, the possibility emerged of cloning a human baby. That's when the talk started. Well, if we can do this with a sheep, we can do this with a baby, or can they do it with a baby? And people started to say that it was wrong, that cloning a human baby from ancestor cell would violate the right of that person to a unique genetic identity. So that really doesn't make any sense because, if you think about identical twins, they share 99.9% of their genes. That doesn't mean that they don't have a unique identity as a twin. So, that's kind of an argument that doesn't make any sense. Another problem with that is that it's making the assumption that your genes are your identity. And that's really a reductionist way of thinking because, that makes up who you are, but there are many other things that make up a person's identity. So, that's one that really didn't make any sense. Another one is that cloning is unnatural or perverse, that sexual reproduction is natural, cloning is asexual reproduction, so that makes it unnatural. What's good for plants and animals shouldn't be used for humans. And, again, they make this claim that there's something wrong with parents who want to clone a child. Maybe they're narcissistic, they're desperate, they've had other events that have failed, but this is a perverted experiment. There's a lot of questions with regard to that objection. It assumes that, the natural way is the best way or the primitive way. And it's, not true for a couple who may be naturally infertile. It also assumes that the new way of making babies is perverse and therefore wrong. And that would negate all of the advancements it made scientifically with in vitro fertilization and other methods that have allowed families who wouldn't otherwise have children the opportunity to have children. Another argument is the right to an open future, and the critics claim that parents who choose to create a child with a certain genotype, like for example, an athlete, an actor, or dad, so they're picking out specific traits or specific qualities, that makes it so that they kind of are forced into a future that may not be their choice. But, isn't that kind of what we do with children anyway? Don't you kind of guide a child into certain sports maybe that you played or into certain areas of interest that may have been interesting to you? So that claim doesn't hold a lot of water because we kind of do that anyway, just naturally. Yes, they will come up with, their own interests, but does picking those traits ahead of time lead them in that direction? Well, probably not necessarily.